This is Red Ice Radio. From the visible to the obscure. RedIceCreations.com.
This is Red Ice Radio. Welcome to all new and regular listeners. My name is Henrik and we are coming to you from the west coast of Sweden in Scandinavia. Good to have you all with us wherever you are around the world. Stay tuned to RedIceCreations.com to follow us on a regular basis. Radio programs on what we consider to be some of the most intriguing, interesting and important topics. And as usual, we leave it up to you to decide what to make of the material presented. Today we have Bob Dean with us. He is a retired Command Sergeant Major in the US Army. Bob claims to have read a cosmic top-secret NATO study called The Assessment while serving in the Operations Center of NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe, or SHAPE, in the 1960s. He says aliens have been visiting and landing on Earth for centuries. And we are going to discuss the impact of full alien disclosure on planet Earth, including government's role in this process. Bob also tells about his own alien visitations and belief that various ETs are distant relatives who serve as humanity's custodians. He says some of them are already walking in our midst. Stay with us as we discuss government's knowledge of the alien presence here on Earth. It is a pleasure to have Bob Dean with us here today on Red Ice Radio. Welcome, first of all, Bob. How are you today? Thank you for coming on.
Well, I'm sitting here in a 112-degree temperature in Phoenix, but all beyond that, I'm okay, Henrik. Thank you.
Excellent. It's good to talk with you. It's going to be really interesting to hear about your background, hear about the work that you've been doing throughout the years, obviously, speaking out about the UFO phenomena, obviously. But I want to go back to, I guess, 1964, if we can, Robert, and begin a little bit from the beginning for those of our listeners here who might not be aware of your work and what you've been doing in the past. And maybe we can talk briefly then about the assessment document and your version of the story, basically, where it begins, I guess, because I've been actually today here reading some of the official statements from NATO. Actually, this is published on their own website. You might be aware of this, Bob, in terms of what you have been speaking about, and obviously, as one would suspect, they have their version of how things have unfolded. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the assessment, Bob, and give us a little bit of the backstory, if you will.
Well, I'll give you some background, but I will tell you up front that NATO will deny through its teeth that anything ever happened. And I've talked to some of the retired military guys that served over there, and they're facing the same damn thing. You know, there was an official document published in 1964, and NATO denies that it ever existed. But we run into that time and time again in the United States government, where they've denied that documents exist. And beyond that, I've gotten used to it. It doesn't bother me anymore. But I'll tell you honestly, I was assigned to SHAPE headquarters in Paris in 1963. And back in those days, it was a choice assignment, and I applied for it. And after about a year of having my background checked out, I got a top secret clearance. And I was given this choice assignment. And I was able to take my wife and children with me and went off to Paris for almost 5 years. But when I got there in 63, Henrik, I learned that a study was underway. And it was curious and it interested me because I had heard through the gossip that it was about UFOs. And that piqued my curiosity a little bit. And one of my first assignments when I arrived in Paris in 1963 to SHAPE headquarters, and I was assigned for duty in the war room, a place they called SHOC, the Supreme Headquarters Operations Center. And my top secret clearance was upgraded to cosmic top secret, which was then and still is today the highest level of NATO classification, other than special projects, of course. Well, anyhow, I arrived in the summer of 63, and the study was underway, and they used to gossip about it. And they ended up finalizing the study in the summer of 1964. And they published it, and they titled it An Assessment. And they had a subtitle about an evaluation of a possible military threat to Allied forces in Europe. Well, I didn't say very much on the front page. I mean, you know, that piques your curiosity, but I'm working in the war room one night. We ran the place 24 hours a day. And I was a senior master sergeant at the time, and I ran the duty roster for the controllers. And the controllers at that time were senior officers, Air Force, Army, Navy, from all services, from all of the Allied NATO forces. And these guys were in charge of the war room for a full shift. And I'm sitting there in my office in the war room in one of the wee hours of the morning, and I jokingly say to people that the coffee was too black to drink, and we'd read all the magazines and newspapers, and we were bored. There was a full-time staff in there of about 15 people all the time. And I'm sitting there, I guess I'm drowsing off and nodding my head and all, and an Air Force colonel comes up to me and hands me a document. And he says, "Here, read this, damn it. This will wake you up." And I opened the assessment, and my life has never quite been the same, Henrik, because it was a conclusion of a 3-year NATO study to determine that these objects that had been flying all over Central Europe for years were not a threat, apparently. And they were not Russian. You know, when these things began to happen, we had a flyover in February of 1961 it was, before I got there, where a flotilla of these objects, these circular metallic objects, flew over Central Europe. They came out of the Warsaw Pact area, the Soviet Union. They flew over Central Europe, and they turned north over the English Channel, the southern coast of England, and then they disappeared off of NATO radar over the Norwegian Sea. Well, that was the trigger that stimulated the study, because Air Marshal Sir Thomas Pike, who was the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander at the time, determined that we're going to have to find out what the hell this is all about. What are these objects? Because for a time we thought they might belong to the Soviets, and we found later that the Soviets thought they might belong to us. After the 3-year study, Henrik, it was determined that these objects didn't belong to anybody on this planet, that they were extraterrestrial, and they had an advanced technology that was so far beyond anything we had that there was not a hell of a lot we could do about it. But the study concluded that apparently there was not a threat to Allied forces in Europe, and apparently not a threat to the human race. And when they published it in the summer of '64, I'm working in the war room. The colonel throws it on my desk, and as I said, it changed my life, Henrik. And I've been researching and looking into this and digging ever since 1967 when I got back from shape.
Well, I bet there's obviously a very, very interesting story that have unfolded obviously since that time, and even before that, Bob. We hear stories about the Foo Fighter phenomena and so forth during World War II. Do you think that might have contributed at least to what sparked the NATO from making the assessment report, or do you know why they overall actually got into it, Bob?
Well, they thought it was a threat, which is why they started a study. And after 3 years of study, they concluded, and Henrik, there was a group of real outstanding experts that were assigned to work on this study. We had scientists, we had top military people, we had men from every scientific field. It was really a blue ribbon kind of group of students, researchers. And they concluded after 3 years that there was not a threat. And they also concluded that apparently the human race and the planet Earth had been under some kind of surveillance, observation, study for centuries by advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. Well, Henrik, that was the thing that really blew me out of the water. That, I was a student of history. I majored in history when I was at the university. And the idea that these not only are here, but they've been here from the very beginning of human history. And that launched me on the study ever since I returned from SHAPE in 1967. And I've launched myself on a in-depth study ever since. It's a wonder I didn't get court-martialed. Because I was sticking my nose into classified documents and files everywhere I went. And as I said, when I got there, I had a top secret clearance, and I was upgraded to cosmic top secret. You had to have that to work in the war room. But I've studied it ever since, and I got so angry over the years, Henrik, that this information was being withheld from the people, from the masses, who I thought had a right to know. Mm. And I held my secret. I held my security clearance. I didn't violate my security clearance. I kept my mouth shut for years and years and years, waiting, hoping that U.S. authorities would eventually make an announcement. In 1991, in Tucson, Arizona, I just had reached the end of the rope. And I began to come out. I spoke at the world's first UFO World Conference in Tucson, Arizona, that Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens, U.S. Air Force retired, had started. And I worked with Wendell. He was a good friend. I helped him put together the first World Conference in Tucson. And I spoke out publicly about the assessment and everything I had learned over the years, and began to violate my national security oath in a big way. And I'll be honest, Henrik, I thought I probably was going to end up in jail. Because when you violate a security oath, you have a threat of $10,000 fine and 10 years in prison. Mm-hmm. And that troubled me some, because I was a professional, and I had worked hard for a retirement. And I had a family. But in 1991, I came out of the closet, as it were, figure of speech there. And I joined Wendell in Tucson, and we put together the world's first UFO conference. And I've been jabbering and blabbing and talking to anybody who would give me a moment ever since. I've traveled the world. I've spoken at least 100 different times in the United States. I've spoken at 18 foreign nations around the world, including Iceland. And this is a subject that I believe is probably the most important issue in human history, Henrik, and that's why I'm still involved with it. That's why I'm going up to Orange County here with Carrie Cassidy and Bill Ryan. I'm going to speak again at that conference. And I've also been invited to speak at the MUFON World Regional Conference in Philadelphia in October. And I recently received an invitation to speak at a world conference in Johannesburg, South Africa. Michael Tellinger, who is an author and a researcher, has invited me to speak there. So I'm an 82-year-old old coot, and I'm still doing what I think is important. And I'll probably drop dead on a speaker's platform sometime.
Well, let's not hope that, Bob, absolutely. But it's absolutely, and this is obviously where some of the things I want to ask you more in detail about and why you consider this to be the most important topic that there is to discuss. I want to briefly, though, Bob, just go back a little bit again here to the document. And obviously, I reckon that you read this from back to front pretty much, maybe even more than once. If you were allowed to, if you got the chance, and just about the conclusion, or if you will, how they at the time in the assessment came to the conclusion that they were not a threat? And as you were reading this, if you had a sense that you were in agreement, in accordance with that, with their conclusions, Bob?
Well, things had been happening all over Europe, and when they put this study together, they had an entire section devoted to the history of the phenomenon. And on top of that, there had been not only flyovers, but there had been landings all over Europe for years. A good friend, an astronaut who passed away a few years ago, Gordon Cooper, told me that when he was in the Air Force in Europe, in the United States Air Force, he was flying F-86 fighters all over Europe, and he said these things were continually flying all over the damn place back then. But then, during the study, they found out that these objects not only had been flying all over the damn place, but they had been landing different places, Italy, air bases in Germany, Denmark, Spitsbergen Island. They'd been landing all over the place, and interestingly enough, crewmen had been getting out of these objects and talking to people. Now that really is kind of a bit of dynamite, Henrik, you know? Mm. A UFO, a 45-foot disc lands, and there are people who see it happen, and by George, the thing comes in on a tricycle landing gear, by the way, and a hatch opens, and a couple of guys get out, and they begin to speak to people in their own language. Mm-hmm. If they land in Denmark, they speak pure Danish. If they landed in northern Italy, as they did, they spoke very good Italian. Well, this was all put into the study. These are little incidents that took place again and again and again. And one of the conclusions of the study, Henrik, is that these guys have been coming here from literally the beginning of human history. The Romans had records of them, you know. The Romans were very good at keeping records. They kept what they called their annales, their annual historical record. And the historical record of ancient Rome was filled with these objects, these flying shields, and also with the fact that even then, back in those days, they would land and guys would get out and interact with people. Well, this little bit of history, you know, really blew my mind. And I found out from the study, the conclusion simply stated that this had been going on probably not only hundreds, but thousands of years.
Interesting.
And,
wow. Yeah.
And the result of the study really was primarily, is there a threat to Allied forces in Europe? And they concluded, obviously not.
Now,
Henry, the repeated demonstration of incredibly advanced technology indicated that if these guys were hostile or malevolent, there was absolutely nothing we could do.
Now, obviously, I want to ask you about what the nature, if there was any detail about that in the document in terms of what was, you know, communicated, I guess. But another question I want to ask you as well is, how do you think that NATO now and other forces, depending on where this document has circulated in what, circles, if you will, but what consequently, if they have acted on this information in one way or another, further contact, further, whatever, basically. What do you make of that, Bob?
Well, it did happen. I'll tell you a little bit of history here. In 1954, President Eisenhower and a complete staff of military and political people from Washington went to a United States Air Force base in California. It's known as Edwards Air Force Base today. But in the early months, I think it was February in 1954, Eisenhower and a staff of his own people met with some of these guys from these other planets. And we have had an intimate interrelationship with one or two of those groups, Henry, ever since 1954. When we determined that they weren't hostile or malevolent, and they had technology we couldn't even begin to match. And so we set up this meeting, and Naval Intelligence established this connection, and the United States has had an unofficial relationship with extraterrestrial intelligence ever since 1954. And when I learned about that, I talked to people who literally had been there. That blew my mind. So I'm excited about it. On top of that, Henrik, I gave Carrie Cassidy an interview here about a year ago. And I admitted and confessed to the fact that I had had a personal relationship with non-human intelligence since I was 2 years old. And Carrie put that on the web. She put it on YouTube. It's all over the damn place, apparently, that I've had this personal relationship. And that's why I'm continuing to speak publicly. That's why I'm trying to tell people this is not something to be afraid of. This is something that can change the world forever, and it's going to be a positive kind of thing eventually when it ever does come out.
Mm-hmm.
But Henrik, when it does come out, it's going to be earth-shaking. When you realize that the implications of this relationship with advanced intelligence from the stars, it's going to impact all of our religious traditions. It's going to shake our scientific community to its very foundations. And it's going to open the door, I think, eventually, and it's one of the reasons I continue to speak, even when I'm not feeling well, and any time I'm down. Hell, I'm 82. I get these little aches and pains and all. But I travel and speak because I believe in my heart that this eventually, Henrik, is going to open up a chance for the human race to literally go to the stars.
Mm.
And that excites me, and I tell people at conferences. I told people in Barcelona 2 years ago, told them in Madrid last year, I spoke in Mexico City, and I tell them bluntly, I said, your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren are literally going to go to the stars. And people seem to find that encouraging. They seem to find that exciting, refreshing, and I keep trying to tell them that these advanced intelligences are apparently not malevolent and not dangerous, and they're not hostile, and they have been trying for literally centuries to nurture and assist and encourage the human species to mature, to develop, and for God's sake to stop waging war. Well, that's the whole point, and that's the thing I'm going to be talking about this month in California.
Absolutely. 1954, that's 57 years, if I have that math correct there, over half a century. Why do you think, at least unofficially, Bob, humanity has not yet been given the true story of this? Why have there been a reluctancy to suppress the information about this? And
part of it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll give you a part answer here. In 1960, NASA signed a contract with an organization in Washington called the Brookings Institute.
Yes.
And the Brookings people did a 3-year study. Well, actually, they initiated it back in 1958, 59. And they published it in 60, and they provided copies to Congress in 1961. And the 3-year study of the Brookings Institute concluded that if we were at some point in the future, not admitting that it already happened, but if we were to ever encounter advanced intelligence from somewhere else, from another planet or another star system, the impact of that reality would be literally earth-shaking. And the Brookings Institute literally recommended in 1961, when this was published, not to release the information to the public because there would be sociological disruption. The people were simply unable to deal with this reality. The facts that we had relationship and we have been visited by advanced intelligence from other planets and other star systems The Brookings people concluded that the masses of people were not ready for that. They said in their study, and this is published and copies are available, that the areas that would be most affected, probably negatively, would be the theological community, the churches all over the planet. The other group that would be negatively affected in a bad way would be the scientific community, because our scientists would literally have to rewrite most of the damn textbooks in physics and chemistry. And the Brookings people concluded that we are not ready at this point, and not to release the information, and to keep it confidential and classified. And that became United States government policy in 1961, Henrik. And it's been an unofficial government policy ever since.
And to a certain extent, when I go through some of the material in the Brookings Report, I understand their point of view. Do you, Bob?
Well, to a degree, yeah. I spoke in February at the 20th anniversary of the World Conference here. And I shared with them a little study that had been a previous part of the study itself. And it wasn't published, but it was a part of the study about the story of Billy Doo, about the young native from New Guinea who had been exposed to Western technology. And it shocked his worldview and shocked his paradigm, and the poor kid literally was unable to deal with it mentally, psychically, psychologically, and he ended up dying. And that was, I think Margaret Mead had included that in the original study group of the Brookings study. Margaret Mead, as you probably may remember, was a very famous world anthropologist who traveled all over the Pacific and studied primitive societies. And the story of Billy Doo was an example of the kind of shock that a primitive society will endure when exposed to an incredibly advanced technology.
Yeah.
Well, the native in New Guinea, Billy Doo, bless his heart, was simply exposed to Western society, Western technology, and he couldn't handle it. His whole worldview just was devastated, and the kid ended up dying.
And so, in comparison to that story, or as a smaller version of what we might be encountering, then when and if they announce officially that ET or visitors are out there basically, or here at that point, is that something that you think would happen to, well, maybe not all parts of the the populace, the human population? That's just impossible to assess, of course. But is there some truth to that then? That might be a reaction from a majority of people?
I'm sure there would be a reaction, Henrik. There are a lot of people. There are hundreds of thousands, probably a few million people, who will be able to deal with that reality. They could accept it. I mean, it would be a shock. It would have to change their historical view, and it would have to, disrupt their old paradigm, so to speak. But there are hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions, who could deal with it. But there are 6 billion people on this planet, Henrik, and this reality, I don't think, would go over very well.
Yeah.
There are a lot of the primitive societies. And one of the areas that troubles me the most is the impact of this reality on Islam. Because you've got a real problem now with fundamentalist Muslims now all over the planet. And how would they deal with a reality that there is advanced technological societies out there and who have been here from the very beginning? And this is the real thing, Henrik. This is the dynamite thing that I talk about frequently and at conferences, and people accept it, and it goes over very well. But I point out in my studies over the last 40 years that I've learned that every major religion on this planet has been initiated and orchestrated by advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. Now that in itself, Henrik, is a bit of a dynamite thing.
Well, of course it is.
Every major religion on this planet has been initiated and orchestrated by advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. And that is dynamite, my friend, and there are millions of people who probably would not be able to handle that.
Well, I mean, that's, to me, Bob, from my perspective, that's a very, very scary thought if one considers the fruits of the major religions of this world and the violence. We have to be honest about this, and the bloodshed that they've created in the name of God or whatever, what they're supposedly representing, and obviously we can look at this from different points of view, that this is man's interpretation of the theology, the philosophy, if you will, and then in the name of that they create this violence. But what does it mean to you, Bob? Because that that opens a can of worms for me anyway.
Well, it opened a can of worms for me originally, but over the years, Henrik, I have made a point of studying every major world religion. I was raised a Christian, as perhaps you were. In the tradition, I was born in the Midwest in Indiana, USA. And I wasn't an avid churchgoer, but, I went to church once in a while. But when I learned the reality of the fact that every major religion was initiated and orchestrated, and I studied every one of them, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Israel, the Babylon, the Hebrew history, the Old Testament. Every publication of every major religion, Henrik, tells the same story. But our ancestors tended to describe these visitors, and these visitors would come and drop down and visit, and, they would land. But our ancestors tended to think of them as angels, that the angels were coming from God. Well, back in the ancient days, the angels taught, proper behavior. Mm. They taught tolerance, compassion, love. Every major religion has that in its initial foundation, Henrik. Hinduism, Islam, all of them. Christianity, the Hebrew tradition, they all, in the very beginning, talked about what Christ, while he was here, talked about. And that's love, compassion, forgiveness, understanding, no murder, no stealing. They taught basic rules of behavior. But over the centuries, politics got involved. Look what happened to the Catholic Church in the 3rd and 4th century.
Yeah.
They took the teachings of this beautiful man from Galilee, and they turned him into the Son of God, and they politicized his teachings, and they totally eliminated things they didn't like the reality of reincarnation. And they screwed it up so damn badly that look what happened over the centuries. The history of the Vatican in the Catholic Church is bloody. They burned Giordano Bruno at the stake in the year 1600. They threatened Galileo, for God's sake, to burn him at the stake. And poor old Galileo had to say, "Oh, I was wrong, I'm sorry." And he lived under house arrest for the rest of his life. Hmm. Well, human beings have taken the original pure teachings of every major one of these religions and screwed them up so damn badly. What you've got today, is only a tiny little piece of what was originally taught.
How do you think they then, with this in mind, feel about this? Do you think that they feel a certain? Obviously, they have to feel a responsibility for this, that they've created the theology and albeit that it's been misrepresented by other men and used for their purposes, but it's still something that has been, from their part, initiated, right?
Well, they initiated it, and they're not particularly happy with what we've done with it. But I've had face-to-face meetings, Henrik, and this is something that I seldom ever discuss. But I told Carrie in the interview a year ago, I've had face-to-face meetings with some of them, and they very bluntly have told me that they're planning to make some major changes on this planet. First of all, they're going to expose themselves. They're going to show us that they're here. And then they're going to strive to correct our historic misgivings and misunderstandings. And they got a plan. And they've had a plan for a long time. It's an agenda. And about 3 of them are working together. I've learned that there are 3 humanoid groups that have been working together for centuries. Mm-hmm. And they have an agenda. And I'll tell you honestly right now that a form of disclosure is underway, Henrik. And everybody keeps talking about, Obama, the president's going to have a news conference, and they're going to get a bunch of people from the press there, and they're going to have the big release and the big news about the fact that we're not alone, and we've never been alone. Well, that ain't going to happen, Henrik, not in any time soon. Mm-hmm. Because that poor man in the White House, he's got so damn much on his plate as it is, he isn't about to have a news conference and release this kind of Pandora's box. But there is a form of disclosure underway, and it is being orchestrated by our friends, our cousins, I call them, from out there. And they show themselves, they hover over airports, they fly over cities. They're here, they're there. They closed an airport in China here a few months back by hovering over the runway. They have a very gentle, subtle form of showing themselves that is not threatening. And I think that's going to continue, and I think you're probably going to see it accelerated. I believe there's going to be more and more and more of it. Mm. And I think that people will be able maybe to accept this without being scared half to death.
Well, we've seen some interesting change in terms of the relationship, if you will, then to ET or the idea of aliens from, among others, the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and they've been speaking out, if you will, in terms of the fact that they are under the same banner. I don't know if that comforts anybody specifically, but it's an indication of something nonetheless. But if we go back to that, what you mentioned about 1954, the communication that was started, or even the, if you will, then the cooperation or relationship between ET and mankind. Do you think that has been discontinued, or is that still in operation today? What do you think about that, Bob?
Well, it has been continued, but the people who that are part of this exchange is not officially the United States government. It's what we call in this country black government, shadow government. There are a group of people in the United States, Henrik, and I think they're in England as well, and probably a few in France and Germany and Italy.
They're around the world, let me tell you. They're here too.
Around the world, yeah. and they have been having face-to-face meetings, as I have. And they're not threatening, and I think they realize that it is coming out, and it's got to be brought out eventually, but it's got to be brought out in a subtle, gentle, non-threatening kind of way. And I think that's going to happen. I said to people repeatedly, I said the form of disclosure literally is underway, but it's what's known as subliminal education. You know, magazines, movies, television shows. You find these little extraterrestrial shows from time to time. Look at the success recently of the Ancient Astronaut series on the History Channel. they're telling people subtly, gently, that our ancestors weren't dealing with angels; they were dealing with ancient astronauts. Well, that's part of the subliminal education that I think people are beginning to accept that. And they're going back to their holy books like the Bible, and they're reading about Ezekiel again, and they're reading about Enoch, and they begin to realize that, our ancient history is a lot different than what we've been taught. But subtly and gently and subliminally, that kind of reality is changing people's view, and I'm very encouraged by that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I'm hopeful by that. I tell you, Henrik, it ain't going to happen in my time. I'm not going to be around long enough for the full disclosure to take place.
What do you think we're talking about in terms of timeline then, Bob?
I think that there's going to be another 25 or 30 years yet before full disclosure will happen. But the subliminal education will continue in the meantime. You see, these guys aren't visitors, Henrik. I mean, they're custodians, if you want to use that term, and I use that repeatedly in my presentations. They've been here from our beginning. One group evidently had a hand in manipulating genetically our ancestors. They literally genetically manipulated Homo sapiens into Homo sapiens sapiens. And they're not visitors, they're custodians, and they're trying very hard to help keep us from blowing ourselves up. They literally, Henrik, brought about an end to the Cold War. When Reagan was in office and Gorbachev was in office, a number of things happened in the Soviet Union and the United States, where extraterrestrial ships, considerable of size, many of them, 1,000 feet across, would hover over intercontinental ballistic missile silos, not only in the United States, but in the Soviet Union as well. And when they would leave, we and the Soviets found that our intercontinental ballistic missiles, the warheads on those things were literally melted. And the guidance systems were so scrambled that if the ICBM ever got out of its silo, God knows where it would have gone, but it wouldn't have exploded. It would just make a hole in the ground,
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was an educational system. That was an enlightenment that they, our cousins, our family, I consider we're related to them.
Mm.
They've made it very clear to the Soviets and to us during the 60s and the 70s, even into the 80s, that they were not about to allow a nuclear war on this planet. Because they apparently venerate this planet, Henrik. I've been told bluntly, face to face, that there are intelligences out there that consider this planet one of the ripest and richest zoological gardens in this quadrant of the galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
And they literally venerate the planet, and they try to keep the flora and fauna healthy and well and alive. And maybe this whole damn thing is an experiment.
Well, it certainly feels like it sometimes. This action, though, Bob, in terms of melting of the warheads and so forth, by the military, from their point of view, wouldn't that be considered to be a threat?
Oh my, yes. I have learned from people in fairly high places in the military and in the politics in this country. Ever since I've been speaking out, people have been coming up to me from time to time. Top military officers at conferences and one thing or another. Top politicians would come up to me and share things with me, and these experiments that were taking place. I mean, when they screwed up our missiles, melted the warheads, scrambled the guidance systems, they made a point very clear. And the immediate response by our military was, we're being threatened. But when they realized that the same thing was going on in the Soviet Union, and I have a feeling it's probably been going on in China as well, they've been making the point that they venerate the zoological garden and they venerate the flora and fauna on this planet, and they're not about to let some of these monkeys start a damn nuclear war. Well, when that really began to sink in, as it were, into the Soviet thinking and the American military thinking, the next damn thing you know, the Soviet Union implodes, the Berlin Wall comes down, and the Cold War is over. But our authorities still believe that the reality of this is such a dynamite matter that they cannot even think about having a major press conference and telling the world.
Yeah, yeah. But let's say that this information, in terms of the melting of weaponry and so forth, if that information was shared with NATO forces and communication is ongoing between the U.S. military specifically, maybe today at least, even between Russia, NATO, and the U.S., what have you, the attitude that was once then reported on in the assessment concerning threat and so forth, that attitude must have changed then since 1964, correct?
Oh, it has indeed. You know, the assessment was simply one study, Henrik. It was a 3-year study in NATO, and it was one little piece of work that, I found it very impressive. But the United States has conducted studies of the similar kind over the years, and we have all reached the conclusion, unofficially of course, that we are in a relationship with advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. And, the military has changed its entire view of a nuclear war. We in the Soviets, or we in the Russians even today, are trying to disarm and get rid of our nuclear stockpiles. But then again, you got a bunch of nitwits over in North Korea and another bunch of nitwits in Pakistan that are building nuclear stockpiles, and, it's a threat to the world. But I will tell you honestly, Henrik, I do believe that our cousins, our friends, are going to make their point very clear with the Pakistanis and the North Koreans. Because I do believe in my heart that they're going to probably drop down and screw up things for the North Korean nuclear missile program. And they're probably going to neutralize all of the nuclear weapons in Pakistan.
Well,
now, they're not going to interfere in our so-called ground wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places.
Okay.
But they are going to interfere if there is a nuclear threat, because they simply will not allow that to happen.
Well, that's interesting. I hope they do the same in Israel and as well. All these countries who have nuclear weapons, who are idiotic enough to gather them and to build them, obviously. But what is difficult, or the situation gets very complicated, I guess, in one sense for me, is that is this initial contact that they made with the military then, from the point of view of NATO and so forth as well. I mean, I understand there's compartmentalization within the military. There is different clearances, different levels, above top secret, etc. But this idea that ET from the beginning seemed to have approached NATO forces, and if we go back to the 60s then, and then 54 was U.S. military, and was there willingness from the ET's part to set up a cooperation with them, because these are the forces in the world who are spreading the violence and spreading the bloodshed, and it's causing so much suffering and misery in the world, as we see today in Libya and other places where there is involvement, right, Bob?
Well, Henrik, the problem is that there are people who know and there are people who don't know. There are a lot of people in our military who haven't a clue about the reality of this matter. I'm sure there are people in Russia who haven't a clue. I don't think the Pakistanis, the North Koreans, I do believe the Israelis have some pretty good ideas, because I think the Israelis themselves have been confronted by extraterrestrial intelligence. I have a friend in Israel who sends me material from time to time, and the indications are that the extraterrestrials, and I hate that term, it's not really appropriate, and the word alien is totally inappropriate.
What would you call them, Bob?
Well, I call them cousins.
Okay.
I call them family, because we are related to them, and out of the three groups we're working with, all three are humanoid, but one of those three groups is so totally human that he can sit next to you in an airplane.
Ah, interesting.
Or in a restaurant, or at a conference, and you wouldn't know. And boy, that blew the minds of the admirals and the generals years ago, that these guys are walking in our midst and we haven't a clue. And you talk about shaking things up. You know, the military, it was our tradition. I mean, we're paranoid, damn it. If we're not paranoid, we're trained to become so. And the idea that an advanced extraterrestrial could be sitting next to you in a theater or in a restaurant or in an airplane or walking up and down the corridors of SHAPE headquarters now in Brussels, walking up and down the corridors of the Pentagon, for God's sake, you know, that shakes them up a lot.
Well,
and
absolutely.
As I said, there are those, those who know. There are those who know, and there are those who do not know. I'll tell you flatly that the United States Navy is one of the organizations that's been in the beginning of this from the very beginning. They've been involved intimately into this, and there are admirals and captains throughout the Navy that have had face-to-face meetings with some of these guys. And as I said, it's still a sensitive issue, and there are guys who do know, and there are ones who don't. But I think that the ones who don't know are going to become smaller and smaller. And in the next few years, I think subtly and gently, there are going to be more and more admirals and captains and generals who are going to have face-to-face meetings. And it's going to change everything.
So, Bob, do you think then, as a way for them to make this contact effort and if you will, then change and influence the right people, we're talking maybe more about individual, contact, person to person, if you will, as opposed to the official landing on the White House lawn, right?
Oh, they'll never land on the White House lawn. That's a stupid little story. I don't know how the hell it ever began.
Me neither, yeah.
But they're too intelligent to land on the White House lawn. You know, because most of the occupants of the White House are not the best examples of humanity.
Well, there you go, exactly. My point.
No politics involved. I used to be a Democrat, then I became a Republican, and now I'm an independent. You know, and I haven't a lot of confidence in that bunch of clowns in Washington D.C. who call themselves a Congress. I'm one of those old farts who said, you know, these guys ought to be run out of town on a log, you know, and we ought to clean house and get a whole new batch of them in there because they're really a bunch of nitwits. But then again, that's my opinion, and being an American, under my Constitution, I have a right to that opinion. And I even have a right to publicly say that from time to time.
Well, that's great that still exists. Let's cling on to that while they are trying to change those aspects of society. But we can talk more about that later, Bob. And obviously, there's many more aspects. Understandably, we won't be able to cover it all here today. This is a long and ongoing story, but there's much more I want to ask you about here in the next segment, Bob, as we wrap things up here for the first. Now, I want to ask you a little bit about websites and so forth as well. You had a little section before on Beyond Zebra, Marsha's website. She was with us recently, by the way. Do you have your own website, or what's going on with that?
No, Henrik, I do not own a computer. I refuse to have one. Marsha is a businesswoman, and she has 3 computers. And she's kind enough to take email for me from time to time, from people, but I do not use her computer, and I really don't feel myself a part of her website. And as I said, because we're married, she's kind and she helps me once in a while. But I don't need that, Henrik. I'll tell you a short story if you got a minute here.
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
In 2003, I gave a presentation at the Bay Area Conference outside of San Francisco, one of the big world UFO conferences. And I presented one of what I consider to be one of my best presentations. And I said to them, I'm out of here. I'm finished. I'm not going to do this anymore. And I told them bluntly, I said, I'm sick and tired of not only the government lying, but I'm sick and tired of the infighting in the so-called UFO community. You know, there was mudslinging and rock throwing and insults back and forth and all that garbage. And that was so-called within the so-called community itself. And I said, look, I don't have to put up with this. I'm out of here. Well, what I did, I came back to Phoenix, and I became a recluse for 5 years. I went into seclusion, Henrik, literally. And I'd had some heart problems, and I think it was stress and anger. And during those 5 years, Henrik, I got into some very serious reflection, introspection, did some serious meditation, and taught myself and learned how to do remote viewing. And during those 5 years, I literally changed my overall psychological outlook on life and the world in general. Mm-hmm. And I only came out of the closet and started speaking publicly again because I was told bluntly by one of my friends from out there that the information that I had been provided was so important that I was expected to get out there and share it and not sit here on my bun and, smoke my cigars, drink my bourbon, eat my steaks, and stew in my own juices, as it were. Mm. And I was bluntly told that I had been given information, they had shared information with me, that they expected me to publicly share it with the people. And then 5 years after my seclusion, I began speaking publicly again, and I haven't stopped. And as I said, I was 2 years ago in Barcelona, a year ago in Madrid, last year in Mexico City, and now I'm invited to South Africa. So as long as my health holds out, as long as, I can get up and get out of bed, I will continue to share what I've been told and what I've been shown. And I will continue to share the fact that I want to tell people not to be afraid, for God's sake. Mm-hmm. That the extraterrestrials are not a threat. They never have been. And the only damn threat we've got is from ourselves here. But I'm going to speak publicly and continue to travel until I have to stop. I did say, I came back from Barcelona and I had a very bad trip home. I found myself on a wide-bodied jet. And I'm sitting in the middle, and you've been aboard them, I'm sure. And two aisles, one on each side of the center section. And, Henrik, I had an enormously overweight lady on my right.
Oh, no. Yeah, we love the center aisles.
I had a squalling brat on my left, and I have an enlarged prostate, which means I have to go to visit the men's room from time to time. And that trip back from Barcelona was just a nightmare. So I had to put out the word to everybody, and I said, look, if you want to invite me, and, I'm honored if you invite me, but I will not take any long-distance flights ever again, coach class or cabin class. If you want me, you're going to have to come up with enough money to get me a business class ticket. And then I'll come. Well, Henrik, I thought that would be the end of it, because nobody's going to come up with the extra money for a business class ticket. And I thought, well, no more invitations, blah, blah, blah. That'll be the end of it. So help me God, I got invited to speak at a big conference in Philadelphia, and they bought me a business class ticket. I've been invited to speak in Johannesburg, South Africa, and Tellinger plans to buy me a business class ticket. So, what can I say? If I can fly long distances over the Atlantic and out to South Africa, wherever, and I can fly with the convenience of a business class ticket, I'll go, Henrik. But I'm 82, and I have a circulatory problem, and damn it, I simply cannot travel cabin class anymore.
I totally understand that, yeah.
I'm sure you do. I'm sure if you've been aboard a plane and you've taken a long flight, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know. Hopefully those business class seats are better these days, though, because they're beginning to kind of downscale those as well, huh? Haven't they? It's all one class.
They allow you. Yeah, they allow you to stretch your legs.
That's right.
Put your legs out. Yeah. They're also there's a private restroom for the business class people. You can get to the toilet without having to stand in line. Henrik, I'm at a point, and I'll bluntly tell anybody who's interested, I cannot stand in line to pee. And that may shake people up, but I'm a blunt old soldier, and I'm telling it like it is.
Yeah, well, hopefully it's a UFO information that gets them a little bit shocked, but no, but that's excellent that you will be able to get down to South Africa. Of course, it must be lovely to travel around to different places around the world, of course, and talking about these things. The interest is huge, as it were, and it seems to be growing all the time, which is interesting as well. I want to mention the website, Bob, as well, for the conference you have in California, then coming up here later in September. I think 23rd, I think was to 25th. Awake and Aware 2011.com, and I'm going to link that up on redicecreations.com as well, so people can click through and easily see the speakers, and you'll be featured there, of course.